Double identity. It went on throughout the night. The gun was put beside my ear, in my groin and in my stomach. They told me exactly where my children went to school, their movements and my movements, and that if I was foolish enough to go to the police, then they had plenty of friends who would send a little explosive parcel through the post. In between all these threats, there was the constant reminder that they were going to take my family away from me and that I might never see them again, and that it would be my responsibility. These are the words of a father who, along with his wife and 2 children, was the victim of a vicious crime in 1991. Terry Allen, as we shall call him, was also implicated in this crime. Terry was born in 1964 and had lived in Ipswich in Suffolk all his life. He was unemployed and very short of money. He had been a small-time crook for many years. Stealing had become a way of life, the means of providing for his wife and 2 small children. Terry was desperate to hit the big time, and one day, when he met a lifelong family friend, he thought he had found the answer to all his dreams. Jack Marsh was 70. He walked with a stick, wore a hearing aid, and had often been in trouble with the police. Jack had been friendly with Terry's father for years, but recently he'd become closer to Terry. Jack's wife had died 2 years before, and he was lonely. Terry looked up to Jack, and they spent hours together talking about Jack's life of crime. Around the end of September 1990, Jack rang Terry. He told him that an old friend of his, someone he knew as John, had asked if Jack knew anyone who would be interested in doing a bit of business. The business was clearly not legal work. Terry needed the money, so agreed to a meeting. About an hour and a half later, Jack picked him up in his car and drove him to a pub in Ipswich. When Terry first met John, he noticed his foreign accent, German or Dutch. He handed Jack some tokens for the fruit machines, and John and Terry sat down. Terry recalls, "John asked me about myself, in particular about the types of crimes I'd committed and the prison sentences I'd served. When I told him that I'd been in detention centres for 3 to 4 months, he seemed surprised. He said I wasn't the type of person he was looking for, but he wrote down my telephone number in code in a small dark-coloured book. On the wall of the bar there was a mirror that carried a brewer's advertisement, Tolly Cobbold. John glanced at it and told me that if he called me he would use the word Tolly. He said that he himself was interested only in crimes that netted him at least £100,000, and he mentioned Tesco's supermarket in Ipswich as a possible target. Terry was impressed with John and liked him. John was over 6 feet tall, in his late 30s, with short, straight, mousy hair. He was athletically built and spoke of his love of mountaineering. He smoked hand-rolled Golden Virginia cigarettes. Terry had never met anyone like him before. On the other hand, Terry didn't think he'd made much of an impression on John. A few weeks later, however, the phone rang. John asked Terry to find out the name of the manager at Tesco and the type of car he drove. Terry did not know what kind of business John had in mind. He thought perhaps John was planning to rob a security van when it made its delivery. Terry telephoned Jack, who agreed to help him. The 2 men drove to the Tesco supermarket and sat in the car park. They identified the manager, who got into a red Rover. They wrote down the car's registration number and tried to follow him, but they lost him as he was heading off towards Colchester. John rang again and said that he was coming to Suffolk. Jack agreed to collect him and bring him to Terry's house. When the 3 men met, Terry gave John the registration number of the Red Rover. John appeared pleased, but then his mood changed. He warned Terry and Jack about his hatred for grasses, criminals who blow the whistle on other criminals, and spoke of one grass who'd been punished with a faceful of acid. The atmosphere suddenly turned sour. Terry was worried. The conversation was clearly aimed at him, and he was left under no illusion about what would happen to him if he went to the police. He was frightened, not only for himself but for his whole family. He contemplated pulling out of the job, but felt that it was impossible at this stage. He was already in too deep. A few weeks later, John made contact again and said that he'd be coming to Terry's house with some other people. Terry sent his wife and children out for the afternoon. John arrived alone. Shortly afterwards, another man appeared. He was in his 20s and slim, with short dark hair. No names were mentioned. The younger man said that he was unhappy about the view into the kitchen from the front window, so Terry suggested that they move into the living room. They closed the curtains and watched some videos. It seemed that they were killing time. Nothing was said about Tesco's, and at about 3 o'clock the two men left. Terry assumed that they were going to follow Tesco's manager to his home, and he went to the window to watch the men. John owned a gold-coloured four-wheel drive vehicle, while the other man drove a red XR2. Later, John called to say that they'd had no luck. Terry assumed that the manager had evaded pursuit and that he would have to bring in a third man. Some weeks passed. Then one day, at about lunchtime, there was a knock at the door. Standing in front of Terry when he opened it were two men. One was the dark-haired young man, but the other he had never seen before. Again, there were no introductions. The stranger was also in his mid-20s, about 5 feet 6 inches tall and quite stocky. He had light-coloured hair that was short and receding. He had a round face and spoke quietly with an Essex accent. The two men waited for about half an hour for John to arrive, then accepted drinks from Terry. They left about 3 p.m. without explaining what they were doing or where they were going. A few days later, John asked Terry to look for a place to hide a car. When they met, John startled Terry by demanding something rather different. He said, "I need a car. Steal me a car. It must be quick, modern, and have 4 doors." Terry explained that he had never done anything like this before, but John wouldn't take no for an answer. After weeks of hesitation during the summer of 1991, a friend of Terry's helped him steal a red 1600 Orion GL. Terry kept it in a lock-up garage awaiting the number plates that were to be supplied by John. The German contacted Terry and gave him the date and time when he wanted the car to be delivered to Brooks Hall Road, Ipswich. Terry was not sure where this was, so John agreed to show him. They drove there together in John's car, now a silver Peugeot 205 GTI, and John instructed Terry that when the time came, he should sit in the Orion and wait until John and the others arrived. On Thursday the 25th of July, nearly a week before the robbery, John telephoned Terry. He said that the stolen car must be parked in Brooks Hall Road at 7 o'clock that evening. Terry still didn't know what the job was, but he went straight to the lock-up, warmed the engine of the car, and drove to the appointed spot. Within a couple of minutes, 2 men arrived. One of them was John. They were wearing suits, shirts, and ties. Terry got out of the car and walked away. He did not look back. Later that evening, John contacted Terry and swore at him for leaving so little petrol in the car. He ordered Terry to collect it and fill it up immediately. Terry didn't take the car to a garage where someone might notice it or him. Instead, he laboriously carried the petrol to the car in 2 small cans. Nearly a week later, John rang again. He told Terry to take the car to Brooks Hall Road the next night and leave it in exactly the same place. He must be there at 8:30 p.m. and the car must be full of petrol. John was aggressive and threatening. Terry felt sure that the job was going to take place the next night. If so, then the target was not going to be a security van as he had thought. Even at this stage, he had no idea what John's plan was. The next evening, Terry did exactly as he'd been instructed. He arrived a few minutes early and remained in the car. At precisely 8:30 p.m., a silver Peugeot with 3 men inside drove past quite slowly. One of them was John. Minutes later, John and the dark-haired man walked towards Terry. He got out of the car as he had before, but this time, as the men drove away, he turned to watch them. John and the dark-haired man were in front, the light-haired man was sitting in the back. All 3 men were wearing dark suits, shirts and ties. Andy Andrews was the manager of Tesco supermarket in Ipswich, where he had been working since it opened in November 1987. Andy and his wife Edna had been married for 20 years. They lived in a bungalow outside Colchester town centre, and they and their two sons, James and Matthew, were a close-knit family. On Thursday the 1st of August 1991, Andy had taken the day off work. It was a beautiful day, and the family decided to have a picnic in the countryside. That evening, Andy and Edna had dinner at a restaurant with some friends. They returned home at about 9:30 p.m. James, their younger son, was watching television, and Matthew was out at a party. A little while later, when the three of them were getting ready for bed, the doorbell rang. As James released the latch, the door was pushed open, and two men burst in, both wearing balaclavas. One grabbed James by the neck, grappling him to the floor. Andy shouted to the man to leave James alone and raced downstairs, but he was shoved against the kitchen door and found himself looking down the barrel of a shotgun. There followed a series of questions. Were they expecting anyone to telephone? Were any neighbours likely to drop in? When was Matthew due back? All the while, the family were told to keep their heads down and their eyes shut. They heard Matthew drive up to the house and park the car outside. As the front door opened, Andy, with a shotgun pointed at his head, was told to act normally. He shouted to Matthew to come into the kitchen, and when his son turned to face his father, he saw a figure coming out of the darkness of the dining room with a shotgun and a belt of ammunition around his waist. Matthew was taken into the main bedroom where his mother and brother were lying bound on the bed. His own ankles and wrists were tied, and he was made to lie on the bed next to his mother. Downstairs, meanwhile, Andy was told that if he did not cooperate fully with the gang, his wife and children would be killed. The men made it quite clear that they had killed before and would readily do so again, and the bodies might never be found. Andy was poked and prodded with the barrels of their guns, and they amused themselves by brandishing their weapons behind his head. He was terrified. The men explained that the next day Andy was to go to Tesco and collect the takings from the safe. In other words, he was to rob his own store. He then had to drive, with the money in the boot of his car, to a nearby DIY store, leave the car there, walk to the railway station, and wait for further instructions. The latest he could leave the car was 3:30 p.m. If he complied, his family would be released unharmed. These instructions were repeated to Andy throughout the night. He asked if he could write them down to make sure that he didn't make a mistake, and the men agreed. At 5 o'clock in the morning, Edna, James and Matthew were untied, taken out of the house and forced into the back of Edna's car, while two of the men got into the front. Edna and her sons were told to keep their eyes shut and their heads down. They travelled for some time before the car stopped and the men got out. They produced some tape and string and once again bound the wrists and ankles of Edna and the boys. Two of the men left. The third one remained with them. He had a gun and a long kitchen knife, and he stood guard over the camouflaged car with its tightly shut windows as the day grew hotter and hotter. Terry woke with a start. It was 6:30 a.m. and someone was banging on the door. He ran to the bedroom window and looked out. John was standing on the doorstep, holding a black bag and what appeared to be a couple of pillowcases. As Terry began to shut the door, John shouted, "Leave it, matey's coming." A few minutes later, the dark-haired member of the gang arrived. They emptied the contents of the pillowcases onto the floor. Suits, shirts, shoes, and a dark-coloured wig fell out, along with string and parcel tape. John said to Terry, "Whatever happens, everything has got to be burned." In another bag was a double-barreled shotgun and cartridges. John said, "Hide it. I'll collect it in a few days." Both men went upstairs to have a wash and a nap, and Terry made a bonfire. The two men woke at about 1:30 p.m., had a drink and left. About an hour later they returned, clearly on edge. Neither man mentioned where they had been. John asked Terry for one more favour. He wanted him to drive a car. He also handed Terry a piece of paper that had the word Samaritans at the top and a telephone number. There followed a list of instructions that referred to a robbery at Tesco and the fact that the manager's family had been abducted. Terry was very reluctant to be involved any further, but John insisted. Andy Andrews drove into work that morning and tried to act as though everything was normal. The time dragged. He tried to do some paperwork but couldn't concentrate. During his lunch hour, he decided that he would have to confide in a few of his staff, as he couldn't run the risk that someone might discover that the money was missing and raise the alarm before the gang had been given an hour's start, as agreed. He asked for his colleagues' help and told them that as soon as he knew that his family was safe, he would ring 999, and that if they hadn't heard from the police by 5 p.m, they should raise the alarm then. Andy got into his Red Rover and left the store at 3:05 p.m. He had with him a security guard, because it crossed his mind that the police might not believe him. He drove as instructed to the DIY store and parked the car. He left the money in the boot and made his way to the railway station. And his family had no idea how long they were going to be imprisoned in the back of the car. On several occasions they asked for a window to be opened. Edna remembers, "I was convinced they would kill us because we had seen their faces. We weren't allowed to move. If we did, the man guarding us would threaten to kill us. The heat was unbearable." And in all this time, Edna, James and Matthew had been allowed to share one glass of water between them. Then a car horn suddenly sounded several times in rapid succession. It was about 3:20 p.m. Edna and the boys saw their guard run down a path in the direction of the blaring horn. He disappeared. When they thought they were safe, Edna, James and Matthew untied their wrists and ankles and climbed out of the car. They walked stiffly to the main road, where they found a builder's yard. Edna telephoned the police from there. Terry, meanwhile, was making his way towards a car in the car park of a DIY store on the outskirts of Ipswich. It was the Red Rover. He'd never driven an automatic before, and he had some difficulty manoeuvring it. As he pulled out onto the main road, still having trouble with the controls, he caught sight of John's silver Peugeot in his rear-view mirror. John was waving at him out of the window, silently instructing him to go faster. Gradually, as he became more familiar with the controls, Terry speeded up, and they drove for about 18 miles before John indicated the car park of Sainsbury in Colchester, and they pulled in. John walked round to the boot of the Rover and told Terry to open it without his gloves on. Terry refused, as he realised that John wanted him to leave his fingerprints behind. When his own car was loaded with the money from Tesco, John drove off immediately. Terry did not see him again for many months. Andy Andrews waited at the railway station for nearly an hour. The deadline passed and no one turned up. He thought something had gone wrong, so he rang the police. "They told me that my wife and children were safe," he recalls. "I couldn't control myself. I just howled. I was so relieved." Detective Superintendent Malcolm Hargreaves was about to go off duty when Andy's phone call from the station came through late that Friday afternoon. Although based at Essex Police Headquarters in Chelmsford, he was the senior officer in charge of the north of the county. He was put in charge of the investigation and arranged straight away for an incident room to be set up in Colchester. He was a family man with 30 years' service in the force behind him, and was well respected by his colleagues. Detective Inspector Dick Block was acting as Chief Inspector at Colchester while his colleague was away, so he automatically became the second in command. And Detective Sergeant Graham Bull, who was on duty, became his deputy. Everyone moved quickly. Detective Inspector Block went to the Andrews home, while Detective Sergeant Bull coordinated the operation from base. A forensic team was also sent to the house, which was sealed off. It was treated as if it had been the scene of a murder, and officers subsequently spent 2 days scouring the place for clues. Detective Inspector Block was very concerned for the Andrews family and anxious to make sure that they were as comfortable as possible. Arrangements were made to bring them back to Colchester and to book them into a hotel, and a liaison officer was appointed to work with them. Detective Inspector Block decided that because of the ordeal they had endured, statements would not be taken from them until the next day. Interviewing each member of the Andrews family and piecing all the information together was a long process. The family all described the events of the previous 24 hours in meticulous detail, but they were frightened of repercussions and understandably hesitant in giving the police detailed descriptions of the criminals. Afterwards, they were given round-the-clock police protection. That evening at around 11 p.m, the police held a briefing. Only the bare bones of the story were known at that time, but one police officer said that 2 weeks earlier she had heard from an informant that Tesco was going to be the target of criminal activity, and that 2 of the men involved were Terry Allen and Jack Marsh. As a consequence, the police had been watching the supermarket from time to time, but they'd unearthed no further information. The next morning, when Terry saw the newspaper reports of the crime, he hid the gun and cartridges that John had left behind in a bin liner among some clothing, and asked a neighbour to look after them for him. On the following Sunday, John rang to tell Terry that he'd be sending him £2,000 for his part in the robbery, and a phone call from the dark-haired man the next day warned him to keep a low profile. If he did, everything would be fine. The robbers did not know, however, that Terry had already been secretly boasting to friends about his part in the crime. This was to be his biggest mistake. The robbery made headline news, and it quickly became known that there was a £30,000 reward on offer. Informants began to crawl out of the woodwork, and information was coming into the police thick and fast. The word on the street was that the gang was from London, but that 2 local men had helped to set up the crime. The names mentioned again were those of Terry Allen and Jack Marsh. One informant's news astonished the police. The man met detectives in a pub and told them that not only had Terry Allen been involved in the job, but he had items used by the gang stashed away at his house, and was expecting a parcel any day that would contain his share of the money. This was fantastic news for the detective team. They knew from inquiries they had made and from the Andrews' descriptions of the men that Terry Allen and Jack Marsh were not the robbers. But if they could catch Terry receiving the money, they'd be able to arrest him immediately, and he and Jack would probably lead them straight to the men responsible for the crime. Police officers camped out in the Ipswich sorting office waiting for the parcel of money to arrive. They were anxious to recover it as quickly as possible, because they had no idea what else might be with the money. Fingerprints, perhaps a letter, an address, anything at all. They'd been authorised by the Home Secretary to intercept the parcel, but when it arrived, the post office insisted that the mail had to be delivered in the normal way. The police got round the problem. First, their postman under surveillance to make sure that the parcel did not disappear en route. Second, an officer dressed in a postman's uniform waited near Terry's house with a fake package and knocked on the door just before the real parcel was due to be delivered. While Terry was signing for it, the police pounced on him. When the genuine postman came round the corner and saw a swarm of officers at Terry's front door, he handed the parcel over to them. The police wanted to make sure that Terry did not touch the package, as it had to go for forensic examination, and Terry's handling it might have destroyed vital evidence. Terry was promptly arrested, and at this stage in the inquiry, the police were very optimistic. They had arrested a number of other people, including Jack Marsh, and had recovered a gun. Now they had the package containing Terry's share of the money taken from Tesco. Detective Inspector Block and Detective Sergeant Bull had interviewed Jack Marsh, who had tried to arrange some kind of deal with the police in exchange for information. He admitted to introducing John to Terry Allen, but he gave little away, and the police were uncertain about how much he really knew. It was not until they questioned Terry Allen that more details began to emerge. Though initially the officers found it difficult to understand exactly what Terry knew because of his reluctance to talk. He was frightened by the seriousness of the crime in which he'd become embroiled, and he was worried that the gang might attack him and his family, or seek retribution in some other way. The police found it incredible that Terry had met the robbers on many occasions over a 6-month period, but did not know any of their names. Yet when he eventually gave details about the other members of the team, the cars they drove, the habits they had, they were convinced that he must be telling the truth. Terry was asked to put together photo-fit pictures of the offenders. He sat with a policewoman for nearly 2 hours, picking out the same pair of eyes over and over again. She recalls, "I got the impression that he was just messing me about. I didn't believe anything that he was doing." In fact, Terry Allen's memory turned out to be very accurate, as she realised when a photograph of the real German came into the office. While Detective Inspector Block and Detective Sergeant Bull were carrying on with the interview, Detective Superintendent Hargreaves and the team were making inquiries all over the country to see whether any more offences could be linked with the gang. 3 other jobs came to light, and officers were dispatched to check them out. One was a robbery that had taken place at Barclays Bank in Kelvedon, 10 miles from Colchester, where a family had been held hostage in similar circumstances. The Kelvedon raid in April 1989 had actually been featured on Crimewatch, but despite a good response, nobody had been charged with the offence. After several meetings, detectives decided to contact Crimewatch again. They had so many details about the German, down to the brand of cigarettes that he smoked and an accurate photo-fit picture of him, and of the others, that they felt confident of success this time. It was a particularly difficult reconstruction for Crimewatch to do because the crime itself was so frightening. It had taken place in the family home. The victims had been tormented with guns and kidnapped for many hours. There was also the problem of finding lookalikes and appropriate vehicles. However, the programme was broadcast on the 10th of October 1991, and the response was overwhelming. 300 calls were received in the studio alone. 2 days after the programme, the police had checked and analysed all the information. In particular, there were 3 callers who gave the same address for the German. One of these was a car dealer who said that he had recently sold a 4-wheel drive vehicle to a German fitting the description, and the purchaser had paid with notes taken out of a paper bag. Other callers gave specific details about the German, and a policewoman had some interesting information to offer. She'd been working on the Thursday night of the programme's transmission, so her husband had videoed Crimewatch for her, and she watched it the following morning over breakfast. When she saw the photo-fit of the German, she instantly recognised him. The previous evening she'd been doing routine vehicle checks along Vauxhall Bridge Road in South London, when a man in a 4-wheel drive vehicle pulled away very quickly from the traffic lights. She had stopped him and asked to see his documents. He had a strong accent and said that he was German. The address of his licence was in Aldershot. He explained that he was visiting his girlfriend in London. All his documents were in order, so he was allowed to go. The name the callers had given the police was Karl Schultz. As informants had supplied an address for him, a surveillance team was dispatched to watch the premises. 3 days after Crimewatch, the police decided to mount an armed raid on the house. The police found only one person in the house, a young woman who claimed that she was Karl Schultz's girlfriend and had not seen him for a couple of days. She was taken to the police station for questioning. They had apparently been together for 5 years, but it seemed that she knew little about him. He had told her that he was an engineer, born in Germany. She explained that Karl had said that he needed to get away for a while, but she had no idea where he had gone or for how long. She had no phone number or contact address for him. All his private telephone numbers were in a black book that he always kept on him. She did, however, tell the police that he was keen on mountaineering and frequently went climbing in Wales. She also gave them a detailed description of the 4-wheel drive vehicle he was driving and said that he had sold his previous one only a week before. The Mid Wales and North Wales police forces were informed. Later that night, a police patrol car was driving through Capel Curig in North Wales when the police officers in it saw what they thought was Karl Schultz's vehicle parked in the car park of the Cobden Arms Hotel. They immediately contacted officers at Battersea Coed, where a special incident room had been set up. 3 officers were sent to the hotel to check the vehicle, make sure that it was the one they were looking for, and confirm that Karl Schultz was still driving it. Their brief was to take a look around and try to find Schultz. If he was on the premises, they were to speak to the licensee and find out how long he was staying. Once they had the information, they were to feed it back to the incident room. As he was known to be a dangerous armed criminal, the plan was not to approach him as yet. As soon as the police officers entered the hotel's lobby, they saw a man walking towards them. He looked exactly like the photo-fit picture. He went into the lounge bar, and they followed. The detectives ordered drinks. From the bar they could monitor his movements. He was sitting with a woman at a table by the window, a girlfriend they presumed. The landlord was sitting too close to Schultz for them to approach him without risking blowing their cover. After some time, Karl Schultz got up with the woman and made for the front door of the hotel. One of the officers phoned the incident room to tell them what was happening. A surveillance unit was alerted to follow him if he left the building, and the firearms team were put on standby. The police did not want to attempt to arrest him inside the hotel because of the danger that hostages might be taken. Karl Schultz and his girlfriend walked out of the hotel towards a waiting taxi. After they'd left, one of the officers noticed that the woman had left her handbag behind. He told the licensee, who quickly ran out with it. When he came back into the lounge, the officers made themselves known to him and started asking questions about Schultz. They did not have time to finish their conversation before Karl Schultz walked back into the bar. The licensee said quickly, "These are the gentlemen who saw the handbag." Schultz thanked them and turned to face the bar. The policemen decided that they had to act before the situation got out of control. So officers placed themselves on either side of the man, wrestled him to the ground and handcuffed him. When he was told that he was under arrest, he said simply, "You've been watching too much television." Back in Essex, Detective Superintendent Hargreaves and his team were waiting by the telephone. Detective Sergeant Bull and another officer had already set off for Wales to help look for Schultz, and he was delighted when he received a call to let him know that the four-wheel drive vehicle had been found. It had been a tense night for everyone. The police searched Karl Schultz's hotel room and found his black address book. This, together with all his belongings, was taken back to Essex. He too was driven back to Essex in a police car. It was a very long journey, and officers were anxious that he might make an attempt to escape. They drove as quickly as possible. One officer sat close to him in the back of the car so he could feel any slight movement, and another officer sat in the front, watching him in a rear-view mirror at all times. It was a very quiet, strenuous journey. Detective Sergeant Bull had faxed pages from Karl Schultz's address book to the incident room in Colchester. It took only a few hours to crack the code, and the police then had before them several useful names and numbers. They were particularly interested in an address in Southend, because Terry Allen had mentioned Southend in his interviews, although he could give no details. The police felt sure that the place had some connection with the robbers. Officers studying Schultz's address book had come across the two names Robert Moore and Sean Wayne. Photographs in the records departments were compared with the photo-fit pictures made with the help of Terry Allen and were found to be identical. Police also discovered that the men owned a silver Peugeot and an XR2. Things were beginning to fall into place. Detectives also had addresses for the two men, so officers were sent with a firearms team to check their houses. Neither was at home. Apparently they were working together in a place not far from Southend, about 20 miles away. Officers arrived in the early hours of the morning to discover that the men were not there either. The only person in the house was a woman who had no idea where they were. Officers searched the house just to make sure they weren't hiding, then rang the detective superintendent with the bad news. He was adamant. He shouted, "Don't tell me this. You can stay out on the road and don't come back without them." The officers thought that the men would probably be driving the silver Peugeot, so they decided to split up and search the area. After a short time, the car was spotted next to a telephone box, and the two men were getting back into it. All officers were immediately called to the area, and they followed the Peugeot until they could find a suitable place to make an arrest. They needed a stretch of road on which there were no other drivers or pedestrians, as the two men were likely to be armed. The silver Peugeot approached a T-junction on a quiet section of road. Looking around, the detectives thought that this was the opportunity they'd been waiting for. The word was given, and within seconds 4 police cars had surrounded the Peugeot, blocking the road. The suspects were pulled out of the car and handcuffed. Neither of them spoke. Sean Wayne and Robert Moore were arrested and taken to the police station to be interviewed. Both men refused to answer any questions. Back at Colchester, the police had uncovered some extraordinary information about Karl Schultz. They learned that far from being a German, he was in fact John Calton from Sheffield, who had previously had a Yorkshire accent. He was one of 7 children and had not seen his mother for over 20 years. He'd been arrested before and charged with a series of building society robberies. He'd been found guilty and imprisoned. When confronted with these facts, however, John Calton always replied with a guttural no comment, even though his alias was now transparent. The police again interviewed his London girlfriend of 5 years' standing. All that time he had never revealed his true identity to her, and she had truly believed that he was German. As for his girlfriend in Wales, she had known him for only a few months and was amazed when she learned that he'd been arrested. She too had believed that he was German. He had told her that he was an only child, had gone to boarding school and was now an engineer. He behaved as though he was proud to be German and had even called his dog Bismarck. She said, "He used to buy me flowers or chocolates, and he was very kind, considerate and funny. He went out of his way to make me feel special. Sometimes I have 4 letters a day from him. He could charm the birds out of the trees." Detective Superintendent Hargreaves and his team were now in the process of gathering together as much evidence as possible before they brought charges. They had a great deal of circumstantial evidence that linked the 3 men with the Tesco robbery. First, the car dealer, who had rung the Crimewatch studio, said that a man with a German accent calling himself Karl Schultz had paid cash for several vehicles, each purchase being made just days after the offence had been committed. Second, the visit of the police to Karl Schultz's address, where the description given by his girlfriend fitted with what Terry Allen had said. Schultz was ostensibly German, had a strong German accent, liked mountaineering, and kept all his contact numbers in a black book. Third, the fingerprints of Karl Schultz, Sean Wayne and Robert Moore had been found at Terry Allen's house. Fourth, witnesses had come forward saying they had seen 3 men dressed in suits in a red Orion. Fifth, the police had found a gun in Schultz's garage with Sean Wayne's fingerprints on it. Despite all this, the police had not one hard piece of evidence that put any of the 3 men inside the Andrews house or at Tesco. When they searched the house, they found no forensic evidence at all. No fingerprints, nothing. What was crucial now was an identification parade, so that both the Andrews and the family taken hostage at Kelvedon would have a chance to identify their assailants. If the victims were able to identify their attackers with certainty, that fact, taken together with all the circumstantial evidence, would, the police believed, provide them with a case. Detective Superintendent Hargreaves remembers what it was like for the investigating team on the day of the identification parade. "We waited in an anteroom while the witnesses filed past the men. We could see from a monitor everything that was going on. The atmosphere was really tense. It was the culmination of all we had been working towards, and none of us could be sure of the outcome." Edna Andrews was one of the first to walk along the line. Immediately she picked out John Calton, and there were screams of delight from the anteroom where the investigating team was watching and waiting. Both John Calton and Robert Moore were identified by one or another member of the Andrews family, and Calton was picked out by the Kelvedon family as well. Detective Superintendent Hargreaves and his team were delighted. The final piece of the jigsaw was now in place. He says, "It was an amazing investigation, the most satisfying inquiry that I've ever worked on." The case was heard at Chelmsford Crown Court during October and November 1992. Terry Allen gave evidence against his co-accused. Before sentencing him, the judge said, "I will bear in mind the assistance you gave at very considerable risk to yourself and very probably your family by having the courage to give evidence in court. I intend to make a drastic reduction in the sentence." Terry Allen was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. When sentencing the robbers, however, the judge was relentless. He said, "Calton, Moore and Wayne, it is rare, fortunately, that I find I have men in front of me who are not only wicked, as you are, but also evil. The way you carried out these brutal and cruel robberies, the money in one sense pales into insignificance, and the kidnap, showed no mercy, and you can expect little from me." John Calton was sentenced to 25 years imprisonment. Because neither had been the ringleader, Sean Wayne and Robert Moore were given 20 years each. For the police, the job was now over. It was a tremendous result. For the victims of the ordeal, however, there is no respite. Their terrifying experience has scarred them deeply. Andy Andrews says that there are still things that happen to the family in the middle of the night or even during the day that remind them of that dreadful time in the summer of 1991. And there are sounds and smells that make a shiver run down their spines. The fear that they live with may diminish, but according to Andy Andrews, it will never go away. This audiobook was produced and published by Penguin Books Limited.